not check to make sure your chores are done. What's up, everybody? Hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Worship Hangover. We're doing another weekday Bible study today, and we are deep into the book of Judges, as many of you are aware. We're going through the book and checking out what we can learn from it. I feel like the book of Judges is like so underappreciated, and it is so good. There are so many great stories and things that happen in the book. That are just incredible. There's also so much that applies into our lives that I think is so significant. So today what we're talking about is God's will versus man's will. That's the conversation that we're going to have today. And we're going to meet a man named Jephthah, okay? And as we meet Jephthah, we're going to talk about God's will versus man's will. That's a common thing, a common conversation to have happen in the book of Judges, because what we see in the book of Judges is we see that God very clearly has a desire, a driving force behind what he's doing for Israel. But what we also see is that Israel has its own will, its own driving forces that often find themselves in disobedience to God or against what God would will for them. And so we're going to talk about that today. My will is God's will, isn't it? Right? Or is it? Maybe not. So I'm going to start reading Judges chapter 10, verse 17, and we're going to get into the conversation as we roll along. Here's what it says. It says, "Then the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped in Gilead. And the people of Israel came together, and they encamped at Mizpah. And the people, the leaders of Gilead, said to one another, 'Who is the man who will begin to fight against the Ammonites? He shall be the head over all the inhabitants of Gilead.' Now Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, 'You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman.' Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob, and worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out around him." Okay, so first of all, we're having this introduction that's happening here, right? And so we see this battle that's getting ready to happen, right? This military battle that's getting ready to happen. And of course, the elders at Gilead, they want to be victorious in this battle, right? And so they're looking for a man who is going to lead them to victory. Now, here's what's interesting. They pre-choose whoever leads us to victory will be our king, more or less, will be the head of us, is what they say. Now, isn't that interesting? Because that's God's role, right? That's God's role. God's role is to choose the warrior. God's role is to place people into the position of authority. Yet they decide for themselves that they will choose the warrior. And whomever they choose, that person will be placed in authority. All of this is happening in their will. Notice that none of the time are they actually asking God what they want. Now, when we meet Jephthah, we find out that Jephthah, we find out that he is a good warrior. He's a solid warrior, right? And so he's had successes on the battlefield. However, we also find out that he has been separated from his family. He's the son of a prostitute, and his kids, right, and his brothers, whenever they grew up, they drove him out and they took away his inheritance, which here's what that means, okay? And so I want you to practically have an understanding of what it means that they would have taken away his inheritance, because it's easy to miss this. So for them to take away his inheritance, first of all, as a son of a prostitute, he had no right to an inheritance unless his father legally adopted him as his own son. right? And if his father would have adopted him as his own son, then he would have had stake in the inheritance just the way all of his siblings would have had. So what happens is his father dies, right? And his brothers don't want to share the inheritance that has been left behind with Jephthah because he is the son of the prostitute, and they've always treated him as a lower class citizen in their household. So they would then go before the elders of the area, before the elders of the community, and they would try their case before them, and the elders would decide whether or not they had a legitimate case that Jephthah should have been included in the should have been included or not, right? In the inheritance. And the elders of the community, they decide that Jephthah has no stake to his father's claim, even though his father's adopted him. That's what would have happened there. And that's significant because of what's about to happen, right? We also learn that Jephthah is a natural leader of men, right? He is cast out of the community by the elders. He's sent away by the elders. He goes out into the land of Tob, and it says worthless fellows collected around him and went out with him. In other words, he was this natural leader that people just kind of pulled around anyway. That's what we learned about him. All right, let's continue his story. Verse 4, chapter 11, verse 4. After a time, the Ammonites made war against Israel. And when the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob. They now want him because he's a warrior, right? They didn't want him because he had equal stake to the inheritance. They do want him because he's a warrior. And they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites." First, they said that whoever was going to do this would be the head. Now they're just offering him a position of military leader, right? They're leading with a lower position here. Once again, my will is God's will, right? Right? But Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "Did you not hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress?" And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "This is why we have turned to you now, that you may go with us and fight against the Ammonites and be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Oh, so now I'm your head. Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "If you bring me home again to fight against the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, I will be your head." And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "The Lord will be witness between us if we do not do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead and the people and made him head and leader over them. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah. Now, here's what's interesting, okay? And this is why we're going to stop here today. The only time in this that the Lord is mentioned is when the Lord is being used as a bargaining chip. Did you catch that? Like, God did not direct the elders to look to Jephthah to make him the military leader, nor to make him the leader of Gilead. God did not direct that. The people did that in their own accordance, right? And God did not direct Jephthah to assume that position. Jephthah negotiated for that position, making the people who outcasted him eat crow and ask him to be their leader, and then solidifying it by using his bargaining chip. Yeah, and if the Lord goes with me, right, then I will be your leader. And they're like, yeah, if the Lord goes with you, you are our leader, right? God is just a bargaining chip that's happening here, which makes me wonder in our lives, right? At what point do we assume without ever asking the Lord that our will is his will, right? That's what's happening here, right? When do we assume without ever asking the Lord's guidance that our will is his will, right? And when we do that, do we ever run the risk of turning the Lord into a bargaining chip? I think that's a really important question for us to ask ourselves, right? If we're going to say that we follow God, if we're going to say that the Holy Spirit guides us, if we're going to say that Jesus lives inside of us, then we have to bend ourselves to his will, not bend him to ours. one question that Alpha and I will often, or not question, one thing that Alpha and I will often say, and one thing that I often pray, I'm in the season right now of potential transition. And so my prayer through the season of potential transition always is, God, if this is your will, you have to open the door. And God, if this isn't your will, I want you to shut the door so tightly that I cannot open it with my own strengths. Right? That's always the prayer in those moments of transition. I think it's really important for us perhaps to live not just those transitional bigger decisions in life moments with that prayer, but I think it's important for us to keep that thought at the front of our minds, perhaps even in our daily lives, in our daily decisions, in some of the smaller things that we do. God, declare to me your will. God, give me every opportunity to fulfill what you have for me. God, you guide me. God, you shut the wrong path to me. God, you reveal to me what is right and what is true, right? We need to continuously make sure that we're seeking God's counsel rather than following our own desires, using God as a bargaining chip and setting ourselves up for failure, because that's exactly what Israel's doing here. They're setting themselves up for failure. That's all for today. I will be back here on Monday, and we're going to continue on with the story. Thank you so much for watching. If you like these videos, give us a thumbs up. I'd love to get your comments, read your comments. So if you have a comment, you can leave them for me. Of course, you can always subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon to receive notifications when we go live. And the best thing, my favorite thing that you could do is share this video with one person who you think would find it helpful or interesting, because that really helps us get this before more eyes, and that's really important. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I love you, and I'll see you